A satellite still. That is where this story begins. Not with a radio call, not with a launch order, but with a single Sentinel-2 frame captured on a clear morning over eastern Donetsk Oblast. A 6-kilometer strip of industrial wasteland running west from the Toretsk coke plant toward a rusted rail spur. Slag heaps casting long geometric shadows, concrete panel walls from a Soviet-era processing facility standing in irregular rows along the southern edge of the corridor. And scattered across that strip, at intervals that look almost random until you plot them on a map, 11 dark smears on the earth, burn scars, each one roughly the footprint of a main battle tank. Andrew Perpetua saw it first. The geolocator, whose open-source work tracking Russian equipment losses has been cited by journalists and defense analysts on 4 continents, cross-referenced the shadow angles against tree-line geometry and known concrete panel spacing visible in pre-war commercial imagery. One by one, each smear locked to a specific coordinate. One by one, each coordinate matched footage that had surfaced on Ukrainian military telegram channels over the preceding 9 days. By the time Ukraine Weapons Tracker completed its own independent cross-reference, the count was confirmed: 11 T-80BVM main battle tanks destroyed in a single sustained operation, 3 MTLB armored recovery vehicles struck while attempting to drag wrecks from the kill zone, and the unit responsible, Ukraine's 414th Separate Strike UAV Brigade. The formation the broader open-source community knows by the call sign Magyar Birds. In the next 34 minutes, we are going to walk through every layer of that operation. The tactical setup that made it possible, the intelligence picture that identified the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade's axis of advance before Russian assault columns, had even cleared the eastern outskirts of the coke plant district. The specific mechanics of a 4-team FPV rotation layered beneath Mavic 3T thermal spotters that denied Russian crews any viable window to abandon their vehicles and survive. And the doctrinal conclusion that Ukrainian brigade commanders, ISW analysts, and at least 2 Western defense attachés have now drawn from those 9 days of footage. Toretsk was the first axis in this war where a battalion-scale FPV unit was specifically and deliberately tasked not with infantry harassment, not with logistics interdiction, but with armor denial as a primary mission. The implications of that shift reach far beyond a single corridor in Donetsk Oblast. But we begin with the ground itself, because the geography of the Toretsk cocoa plant approaches is not incidental to this story. It is the reason 11 tanks burned there instead of somewhere else. Toretsk sits on the western edge of the Donetsk coal basin, a mid-sized industrial city that by the summer of 2024 had become one of the most contested urban nodes on the entire Eastern Front. Russian forces of the 6th Combined Arms Army had been pressing against the city's eastern and northeastern outskirts since the collapse of the Avdiivka salient in February 2024 accelerated Russian tactical momentum across the broader Donetsk operational direction. By late summer, the axis of main Russian effort had shifted toward the coke plant, a sprawling complex of processing towers, slag heaps, conveyor structures, and reinforced industrial buildings dominating the high ground immediately east of the city center. The coke plant matters for the same reason industrial complexes always matter in urban warfare: elevation, hardened structures, and observation. Whoever controls the slag heaps controls line of sight across a 6 to 8 kilometer arc. Russian planners understood this. The 132nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, a formation rotating through the Toretsk axis since mid-2024 that had taken documented losses in the industrial district east of the plant, was assigned the push west through the coke plant approaches, a corridor bounded on the north by the slag heap line and on the south by the rail spur running toward the Toretsk 2 station. The corridor is approximately 6 kilometers long and, at its narrowest point, barely 800 meters wide. In the language of armored warfare, that is a channelizing terrain feature. Tanks moving west through it have limited room to maneuver off-axis. They are funneled. Russian military planners had presumably weighed this. The T-80BVM is not a vehicle you send into a channelized approach lightly. It is one of the most capable tanks in the Russian ground forces inventory, a 3rd-generation main battle tank with a 125mm smoothbore gun, Contact 5 explosive reactive armor across the turret and hull, and the Arena Me active protection system on later production variants, though open-source imagery showed Arena Me fitment across the 130 seconds vehicle pool was inconsistent. The T-80BVM runs on a gas turbine engine rather than the diesel power plant used in the T-72 and T-90 families, which gives it significantly higher top speed, up to 70 kilometers per hour on road, but also a higher thermal signature and substantially greater fuel consumption. In a sustained urban fight where resupply lines are under constant pressure, the gas turbine is a liability. In a fast push through a channelized approach, the planners apparently decided the speed advantage justified the risk. Here is what is worth noting about the 130 seconds operational approach in this corridor. It was not reckless by the standards of how Russia had been fighting elsewhere on the Donetsk front in the same period. The assault columns were structured with infantry dismounts preceding the tanks, using the concrete panel rows along the southern edge of the corridor as partial cover. Recovery vehicles, the MTLBs subsequently destroyed, were pre-positioned at the eastern mouth of the corridor, rather than trailing the column, which suggests the brigade's logistics officers had anticipated vehicle casualties and planned for rapid recovery to prevent Ukrainian forces from using wreck sites as observation reference points. There was a logic to it. What that logic did not account for was the 414th. Ukraine's 414th Separate Strike UAV Brigade emerged from the doctrinal lineage the broader Ukrainian drone warfare community calls the Magyar Birds model, a framework for battalion and brigade-scale UAV employment that developed organically from the combat experience of operators who had been running FPV missions since the early months of the full-scale invasion. The callsign Magyar comes from a specific operator whose footage and tactical innovations became reference material within the Ukrainian UAV community. The brigade formalized and scaled those innovations into a structured combined arms approach. By the time of the Toretsk operation, the 414th had been operational as a formed unit for several months and had conducted prior missions in the broader Donetsk direction, though the scale and duration of the coke plant corridor campaign represented a significant escalation in the brigade's operational tempo. The fundamental innovation of the Magyar Birds doctrine, and the thing that made the Toretsk operation qualitatively different from the FPV employment Ukraine had been conducting since 2022, is the explicit separation of the spotter function from the strike function, combined with a rotation system that maintains continuous coverage over a target zone without burning out individual operator teams. Most FPV employment in this war has been reactive. An operator identifies a target of opportunity, launches, strikes. The Magyar Birds approach is predatory. Mavic 3T thermal drones, the commercial quadcopter platform with a dual visible light and thermal imaging payload that has become near ubiquitous in Ukrainian reconnaissance operations, fly sustained overwatch at altitude above the target zone. Their job is not to strike. Their job is to watch, to track, and to hand off targeting data to dedicated FPV strike teams waiting on the ground. The four-team FPV rotation, the 414th employed in the Toretsk corridor, operated on what Ukrainian after-action reporting describes as a continuous presence model. At any given moment during the 9-day campaign, at least two of the four teams were in an active launch-ready state, with their FPV platforms, primarily first-person view racing drone airframes carrying shape-charge warheads in the 500 to 800 gram range, pre-armed and staged within the operational radius of the corridor. When a Mavic 3T spotter team identified a target, the handoff to the nearest FPV strike team took, according to Ukrainian accounts of the operation, between 40 and 90 seconds. The rotation system ensured that when one team expended its available platforms and required resupply, a second team was already in position. There was no gap, there was no window. This is the part that matters most for understanding why 11 tanks burned rather than 4 or 5. In conventional FPV employment, a Russian tank crew that survived an initial strike had a viable option: abandon the vehicle, move to covered ground, wait for recovery. The vehicle might be salvageable. Even if not, the crew survived. The 414th's rotation system closed that option. The Mavic 3T Overwatch tracked every vehicle in the corridor continuously. A crew that dismounted from a struck tank was immediately visible in thermal. A recovery vehicle that moved toward a wreck site was a new target. The corridor became, in the operational language of the brigade's own after-action documents quoted by Ukrainian defense journalists, a managed kill zone rather than a contested approach route. Put yourself in the position of a T-80BVM commander in that corridor on day 3 of the operation, when the pattern would have been clear to anyone paying attention. You have seen 2 tanks from your battalion burn in the preceding 48 hours. You have received no confirmed reports of the recovery vehicles reaching those wrecks. Your infantry dismounts are reluctant to advance past the concrete panel line because the thermal drones are overhead and they know what overhead thermal coverage means for anyone moving in the open. Your battalion commander is pushing you to continue west because the brigade's operational timeline requires the coke plant observation points to be in Russian hands before the next scheduled assault on the city's northeastern district. You move, and the Mavic 3T operator at 400 meters altitude, watching through a thermal lens, marks your engine heat signature and passes the coordinate to the FPV team that has been waiting since dawn. That is not a hypothetical reconstruction. It is a description of what the footage shows, frame by frame across the documented strikes. We spent considerable time going through the available video record for this operation, and one detail kept coming back: the consistency of the strike geometry. In 9 of the 11 confirmed tank kills, the FPV impact point is the rear deck, the engine compartment, and the rear of the turret bustle. This is not coincidence. It reflects a specific targeting discipline that the 414th operators had developed based on accumulated experience with T-80BVM armor layouts. The Contact 5 ERA on the frontal arc and the turret cheeks is dense enough to defeat or degrade a shaped charge in the 500-gram range. The rear deck, where the gas turbine exhaust and the ammunition resupply hatch are located, is protected by a thinner ERA package. A hit on the rear deck that penetrates to the ammunition storage. The T-80BVM carries its main gun rounds in an automatic carousel beneath the turret, produces a catastrophic kill. The turret separates. The hull burns. There is no recovery. 7 of the 11 T-80BVMs in the Toretsk corridor show turret separation in the available footage or in the satellite imagery. The other 4 show hull fires consistent with fuel ignition from rear deck penetration. The distinction matters for the OSINT verification work. Turret-separated hulls are straightforwardly identifiable in Sentinel-2 imagery at 10-meter resolution because the turret displacement creates a distinctive asymmetric shadow pattern that differs from intact vehicle silhouettes. This is the specific pattern that Andrew Perpetua's geolocation methodology exploits, matching the shadow geometry of individual wrecks against the known sun angle at the time of the satellite pass, then cross-referencing with tree line and concrete panel reference points to assign precise coordinates. Ukraine Weapons Tracker's independent verification used a complementary methodology, comparing the concrete panel spacing visible in FPV strike footage. Panels from the Soviet-era processing facility along the southern corridor edge are spaced at approximately 3.2-meter intervals, a measurement extractable from pre-war commercial photography, against the panel spacing visible in the drone footage to confirm that specific footage matches specific locations rather than being misattributed from elsewhere on the Donetsk front. The 2 methodologies converged on the same 11 coordinates. The verification is as solid as open-source evidence gets in an active war zone. If this investigation is holding your attention, subscribe to Shadow Battlefield. We publish OSINT-driven investigations like this one every week, going frame by frame through the footage and the satellite data so you understand not just what happened, but how we know it happened. Now, the recovery vehicles. Because the destruction of the 3 MTLBs is not a footnote to the tank story. It is a separate tactical decision that reveals something important about how the 414th understood the operation's objectives. The MTLB is a Soviet-era multi-purpose tracked armored vehicle that Russian ground forces use extensively as a battlefield recovery platform, towing disabled vehicles, evacuating casualties, moving supplies under fire. It is lightly armored and slow, but tracked and available in large numbers. The 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade had pre-positioned 3 MTLBs at the eastern mouth of the coke plant corridor, as noted earlier, in anticipation of vehicle casualties. When the first T-80BVMs were struck on day 1 and day 2 of the operation, the recovery crews moved forward. The decision to strike the recovery vehicles was not automatic. Ukrainian after-action accounts suggest it was a deliberate command decision by the 414th's operational leadership made on day 3 after the first recovery attempt. The logic was doctrinal rather than tactical. If recovery vehicles can reach struck tanks, Russian brigade commanders retain the option of continuing to push armor into the corridor because the cost of vehicle losses is partially offset by salvage. If recovery vehicles cannot reach struck tanks, the wrecks themselves become obstacles that further channelize subsequent movement, and the psychological cost to Russian crews of operating in a zone where they cannot expect evacuation or vehicle recovery rises sharply. Destroying the MTLBs was not about the MTLBs. It was about closing the corridor permanently. The first MTLB was struck on day 3 approximately 340 meters east of the second tank wreck from the initial day 2 kill. Footage shows the vehicle moving at low speed toward the wreck site, towing cables already deployed from its rear when 2 FPV platforms, a paired strike approach the 414th uses against harder targets, impact in sequence on the hull roof and the engine deck. The MTLB burns. The second recovery vehicle was struck the following day, day 4, at a position approximately 200 meters further east. The 132nd's logistics officers had apparently attempted a slightly different approach route. The third MTLB was struck on day 6, by which point the 132nd's attempt to clear the corridor had effectively stalled, and the recovery vehicle appears to have been moving not toward a tank wreck, but toward the second destroyed MTLB, whose chassis was partially blocking the approach route. By day 6, the corridor was becoming impassable not through Ukrainian demolition or artillery, but through the accumulated mass of destroyed Russian equipment. 11 tank-sized burn scars plus 3 MTLB hulks across 6 kilometers of channelized terrain, in positions that could not be cleared without exposing additional recovery assets to the same Overwatch system that had destroyed the first 3. The obstacle was self-reinforcing. Here is the take that will probably generate some disagreement. The Russian brigade's command made a mistake that was not inevitable. The 132nd's operational plan for the coke plant corridor was not unreasonable given what Russian commanders knew about Ukrainian drone capabilities in mid-2024 based on experience elsewhere on the front. The problem is that the 414th represented a capability the 132nd's intelligence picture had not captured. Most FPV employment that Russian units had encountered prior to Toretsk was reactive and limited in duration. Ukrainian teams would strike, expend available platforms, and require resupply delays before re-engaging. The continuous presence rotation model was not yet widely understood as a fielded capability. Russian brigade commanders planning operations in this period were, in a real sense, calibrating their risk assessments against the wrong threat model. That is not an excuse, it is an explanation. And the distinction matters because it tells us something about how Russian operational planning will adapt. Intercepted communications fragments, cited in Ukrainian military reporting and partially reproduced in translated excerpts on Ukrainian defense telegram channels, give a sense of how the 132nd's internal communications evolved across the 9 days. Early intercepts show relatively routine operational coordination, vehicle movements, ammunition resupply requests, casualty reports using standard formats. By day 5, the tone had shifted. One fragment, attributed to a battalion-level commander and quoted in reporting by Ukrainian defense journalists, includes the phrase, translated roughly from the Russian, that the corridor is not a passage, it is a camera. Another fragment, from day 7, appears to be a request from the 132nd's Brigade headquarters to the 6th Combined Arms Army's operational staff for guidance on alternative approach routes, noting that the coke plant corridor axis had produced unacceptable vehicle losses. The Army-level response, if there was one, has not surfaced in available open-source material. What did surface, beginning on day 8, was a shift in Russian tactical approach. Instead of pushing armored columns through the corridor, the 132nd began attempting to use dismounted infantry advances along the concrete panel line, with individual soldiers moving in short bounds between cover positions. It was slower, costlier in infantry casualties, and less effective at reaching the coke plant observation points that had been the original operational objective. But it was an adaptation. The Mavic 3T Overwatch could track infantry movement and hand off to FPV strike teams, and Ukrainian accounts describe additional FPV strikes against dismounted groups during this phase. But infantry, dispersed and using cover, is a harder target for the available warhead sizes than a 45-ton tank. The 414th's primary mission was armor denial. Against the infantry-only approach, the brigade's kill efficiency dropped, and the tactical situation became a more conventional infantry versus infantry contest. The 9-day campaign formally concluded, in the operational sense of the 414th's documented activity in the corridor, on day 9 when the final T-80BVM kill was confirmed. After that date, the available footage from the corridor shows no further large armored platforms attempting to push west. The corridor had been denied. One detail that stayed with me after going through all of the available footage: the silence in the later strikes. In the early day footage, you can hear Ukrainian operator communications in the background of some recordings. Brief coordination calls, grid references, confirmation of visual contact. By day 7 and day 8, the strike footage is quieter. The teams had settled into a rhythm. The operation had become, in some sense, routine, not because it was easy, but because the system was working and had stabilized. There is something almost procedural about the last 3 tank kills. A thermal track, a handoff, an intercept, a burn scar on the corridor floor, another coordinate confirmed. What do you think? Does the rotation model the 414th used represent a genuine shift in how drone warfare scales? Or is it a tactic that Russian forces will learn to defeat within the next operational cycle? That question is worth sitting with, because the answer shapes how you interpret everything that comes after Toretsk. The battle damage assessment work that followed the 9-day campaign produced numbers worth examining carefully, because they illustrate both the direct and indirect costs of the 130 seconds failed push. 11 T-80BVMs at approximately $3 to $4 million per hull in replacement cost. The figure is approximate because Russian domestic defense procurement pricing is not fully transparent, but Western defense analysts, citing export pricing for comparable platforms, have used a $3 to $4 million range. Represents a direct equipment loss of between $33 and $44 million for a single brigade operation over 9 days. The 3 MTLBs add perhaps another $300,000 in direct equipment cost, a figure that is almost irrelevant against the tank losses but matters for what it says about the recovery infrastructure. The indirect costs are harder to quantify but arguably more significant. The 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade's armored strength on the Toretsk axis was substantially degraded. ISW's daily assessment reporting for the relevant period notes that Russian offensive activity in the coke plant approaches stalled following the peak of the 414th's operation, with Russian advances in the subsequent 2 weeks limited to dismounted infantry actions in the industrial district north of the corridor, rather than the mechanized push toward the observation points that had been the original operational objective. The timeline for Russian control of the coke plant high ground slipped. How far it slipped, and what the second-order effects of that slip were on adjacent axes, is not fully visible in the available open-source data. But the basic causal chain is clear. The 414th denied the corridor. The armored push stalled. The observation points remained contested. Here is what this case tells us about the current state of armor employment in the Donetsk operational direction. The T-80BVM, which Russia had been deploying as a prestige asset, a signal of capability and commitment on priority axes, is no longer a reliable instrument for forcing channelized approaches against a prepared FPV defense. That conclusion, if it has been internalized at the Russian operational level, has significant implications for how Russia stages assault columns across the broader front. A formation that cannot confidently push tanks through narrow corridors without accepting disproportionate vehicle losses is a formation that faces difficult choices. Use infantry at higher cost and lower speed, find wider approach routes that may be less tactically advantageous, or invest in counter-drone capabilities capable of defeating the Magyar Birds rotation model. The counter-drone question is worth examining carefully, because it is where the operational story of Toretsk connects to the broader doctrinal trajectory of the war. Russian forces have been attempting to field electronic warfare systems capable of jamming FPV guidance links since at least mid-2023. and there is documented evidence from multiple frontline axes that Russian EW deployment has degraded Ukrainian FPV effectiveness in specific contested areas. The question for the 414th model specifically is whether EW can defeat the Mavic 3T overwatch function as well as the FPV strike function, because the rotation model depends on the spotter layer remaining viable. A jammed FPV that cannot reach its target is a failed strike. A jammed Mavic 3T that cannot maintain thermal track of moving armor is a broken kill chain. Ukrainian operators and unit commanders have publicly discussed in general terms the EW challenge and the adaptations being developed in response. Frequency hopping, redundant control links, and the use of visual rather than thermal targeting in specific lighting conditions are among the approaches cited. The specifics of how the 414th addressed EW in the Toretsk corridor are not available in open source reporting, which is frankly as it should be for an active capability. What is visible is the outcome: 11 tanks burned across 9 days, suggesting that whatever EW the 132nd deployed in the corridor did not sufficiently degrade the 414th's kill chain to alter the operation's result. Most people following this conflict assume that the FPV drone story peaked in 2023 and that the tactical equilibrium has stabilized. The evidence from Toretsk suggests that assumption is wrong. The Magyar Birds doctrine is a second-generation application of the same underlying technology, not faster platforms or bigger warheads, but a more sophisticated operational architecture that addresses the specific vulnerabilities of first-generation FPV employment, limited coverage duration, gaps between strike waves, and the absence of dedicated persistent overwatch. The 414th did not invent a new weapon. They invented a new way to use existing weapons continuously. In military history, that kind of innovation is often the more consequential one. There is a line in the Ukrainian General Staff's reporting on the Toretsk operation that reads almost like a tactical textbook entry. Sustained presence over the objective area was maintained through team rotation, ensuring no window for adversary recovery operations. Dry language for a 9-day campaign that destroyed $44 million of Russian armor. But the dryness is intentional. The Ukrainian military is describing a procedure, a repeatable procedure. Not a one-off tactical success, but a methodology that can be trained, replicated, and scaled to other axes. That is the part that Russian operational planners, if they are reading the same open-source record that we are reading, should find most concerning about Toretsk. A single tactical setback is recoverable. A validated, scalable doctrinal model fielded by a formed brigade with months of operational experience is a different kind of problem. Comment yes or no below. Do you think Russian forces on the Donetsk front will develop an effective counter to the continuous presence FPV rotation model within the next 6 months? We read every response, and the divergence in analytical opinion on this specific question is sharper than you might expect. The historical parallel that comes to mind, and it is an imperfect parallel, as historical parallels always are, is not from any of the obvious drone warfare precedents in the post-2001 period. It is from the later phases of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, specifically the period after Israeli armor had absorbed devastating losses from Egyptian Sagar missile teams on the Suez Canal front and was forced to develop combined arms responses integrating infantry, artillery, and air support to defeat the anti-armor threat. The tactical situation was different in almost every physical detail. The doctrinal challenge was structurally similar. A mobile armor force encountering a persistent, patient, denial-oriented anti-armor system that did not need to be everywhere, only in the corridor where the armor was forced to go. The solution in 1973 involved years of doctrinal adjustment and cost-intensive combined arms integration. Russia in 2024 does not have years. Does history repeat itself here? Not in the sense of inevitable outcomes. The Yom Kippur analogy is about the doctrinal problem, not the political resolution, but in the sense of a technologically capable armor force discovering the limits of armor dominance against a patient, position-aware denial system. Drop your analysis in the comments. The comparison has generated serious disagreement among the analysts and historians we have spoken with in developing this investigation. Toretsk did not end the Russian push toward the coke plant observation points. It stalled it, degraded it, and forced an operational adaptation that bought Ukrainian defenders time and cost Russia a significant fraction of a brigade's armored strength. whether that time is being used effectively, whether the doctrinal lessons the 414th demonstrated are being scaled across other Ukrainian formations facing similar channelized approach problems, and whether Russian operational planning at the army and front levels has genuinely internalized the implications of what happened in that 6-kilometer corridor. These are the questions that will determine whether Toretsk becomes a historical data point or a doctrinal turning point. 3 questions to leave you with, because they keep coming back when you sit with the evidence long enough. Could Russia have prevented this? Not in the counterfactual sense of could they have not sent tanks into the corridor. The operational pressure on the Toretsk axis was real and the timeline constraint was real. But could better intelligence on the 414th specific capabilities, better EW preparation, or a different column structure have changed the kill ratio enough to make the push viable? The answer is genuinely uncertain, and it matters for how you evaluate Russian operational planning going forward. How does what happened in Toretsk change the calculus for NATO planning on continuous front armor employment? The Magyar Birds doctrine was developed in combat, not in a doctrine center. NATO's existing combined arms frameworks treat FPV as a disruption threat, not a denial system. If a battalion-scale unit can reliably close a 6-kilometer corridor to armored movement over 9 days using off-the-shelf commercial drone platforms and a rotation protocol that can be taught in weeks, what does that mean for the force structure assumptions underlying NATO's Eastern Flank defense planning? And the third question, what is the 414th's next operational assignment? The brigade exists. It has a validated methodology. It has experienced operators who have run this specific system under combat conditions. Where Ukraine chooses to deploy that capability next, which axis, which approach corridor, which Russian formation, will tell us a great deal about how Ukrainian operational planning has absorbed the lessons of Toretsk. Watch the deep state map, watch the satellite imagery, watch the Telegram channels where the footage surfaces. The next 9 days are already being planned somewhere. If this kind of frame-by-frame OSINT investigation is what you come to this channel for, subscribe now. We do this every week. Satellite imagery, intercept analysis, unit-level kill accounting, doctrinal context. Not summaries, investigations. The next one goes even deeper. 11 burn scars on a 6-kilometer strip of Donetsk slag and concrete. $44 million of Russian armor, confirmed by shadow geometry and concrete panel spacing measured to the centimeter by analysts working from open-source satellite data, and a procedural methodology documented in after-action reports and replicated in frame after frame of strike footage that the Ukrainian military now calls standard practice. The corridor is closed. The question is where the 414th opens the next one,